In a South Carolina town, a father named Nick Hume stops by a gas station on the sketchy side of town. His eldest son, Brendan, goes into the store to buy a slushy drink. Without warning, two cars stop by the store. Masked thugs spill out of the vehicles, storming into the store with their weapons brandished. They all shout at the clerk to get down, seeming like they're there for a robbery. However, they don't even let the clerk attempt anything before shooting him in cold blood. Brendan is caught inside of the store, shock and fear paralyzing the high schooler. Outside, Nick hears the commotion and rushes toward the store to save his son. His desperate sprint is interrupted when another customer, trying to frantically escape the terrifying scene, hits Nick with their car. The thug doesn't shoot Brendan, but encourages one of his friends to kill him so he can be initiated into their gang.
Get your gun! Do this, or you're not one of us!
The initiate hesitates, but under the aggressive direction of his peers, he draws out his machete and slices Brendan's throat. The others immediately flee, but the initiate falls behind due to the adrenaline rush of his first kill. Nick scrambles towards the store on an injured leg. He makes it just in time to tackle the initiate as he walks out of the store to run away. He removes the young man's mask, getting a clear look at his face. The initiate punches Nick, breaks free from his grasp, and runs out into the street. He gets hit by a passing car but still manages to escape into the dark. Nick abandons the pursuit because his only concern is his son, who is bleeding out on the floor. Nick rushes him to the hospital with desperate speed. His wife, Helen, and their younger son, Lucas, arrive at the hospital shortly after, only to discover the devastating truth that Brendan has died from severe blood loss. The family is destroyed by this senseless act of violence. The following day, Nick goes to the police station to single out his son's murderer from a line of suspects they had arrested. With his memory still fresh from that fateful evening, Nick confidently declares a young man named Joe Darley as the culprit. Then, they hold a funeral on a rainy and dismal afternoon, perfectly mirroring the endless gloom in their hearts. The grief lingers in the family like a disorienting fog. Back home, Nick spacely announces that he will attend a pre-hearing for Brendan's murder trial. In bed, Helen talks about Brendan's team wanting to do a memorial for him. This breaks her quiet grief as she sobs beside her husband. They hold hands to support each other until they fall asleep. Meanwhile, Lucas sneaks out of bed at night to enter his late brother's bedroom. Nick is awakened by the sound, and he witnesses his younger son trying to deal with his own grief as quietly as he can. During the pre-trial meeting, Nick meets with Detective Jessica Wallace and the district attorney to discuss the legal proceedings. The attorney reveals that their best plan to put Joe Darley behind bars is to make a reduced sentence deal with the public defender, resulting in a guaranteed 3 to 5 years of prison time. Nick is baffled. He wants his son's murderer to receive a life sentence, but the attorney says there's a good chance Joe will walk free if they make that move. Nick also learns from Wallace that Brendan's murder served simply as an entry fee for Joe to join a stupid gang, an initiation ritual that cost Brendan his life. 3 years is an insulting punishment for the destruction of his entire world, Nick thinks. So, during the first hearing, Nick rescinds his statement, saying that he's not sure Joe is the culprit after all and dismissing the case. The 23-year-old killer walks out of the courthouse as a free man. He is immediately greeted by the gang members who loudly applaud Joe's successful initiation into their violent brotherhood. The gang's leader, Billy, personally congratulates Joe. They seem quite close, lost in their little bubble, not noticing that Nick has been watching them from a distance all along. He deliberately sabotaged the trial because he plans to deliver a much harsher punishment with his own 2 hands, believing the legal system will fail him. The gang drives away, and Nick secretly trails them to a low-income residential area. Billy rewards Joe with a clutch of cash and a prostitute to have fun with. The rest of the gang eventually leaves the area, and Joe goes inside an apartment with the woman. Nick returns to his own home, thoroughly disappointed by the legislation, and begins looking for a weapon. As he goes through the toolbox, Lucas walks in, right before Nick finds an old knife in the toolbox. After wrapping it up and concealing it, he looks at Lucas, who's asking a lot of questions about where his older brother died. When Helen walks in, Nick reveals that the court let Joe walk free because Nick wasn't sure he was the killer. Feeling his frustration being let out at his family, he pretends that he'd left something at his office and needs to go back out. Nick gets into his car and drives straight back to the apartment complex where Joe is staying. He parks his car in the shadows and waits patiently for his target to emerge while questioning if he should be doing this at all. Eventually, Joe walks out of the building. Nick leaves his car and waits in the shadows until other people in the yard have left before walking up to Joe, who's taking out the trash. He turns around and is completely surprised to discover Nick standing right there. Joe recognizes him, and it takes Nick a breath before he lunges at the young gang member. He pins Joe to the wall before Joe Joe fights back and tackles Nick to the ground. Nick's concealed knife clatters to the concrete floor. The two men engage in a desperate and clumsy struggle until Joe scrambles to grab the blade. Before Joe can use it, Nick holds him down and throws punches repeatedly. Somewhere along the way, the knife accidentally stabs Joe deep in his chest. Nick reels back and watches in horror as the young man gasps in shock and dies on the ground. The reality of what he has just done crashes down on Nick. He has become a murderer, just like the boy lying dead in front of him. Still in shock, he pulls out the knife from Joe's body and drives away to a bridge over a dark river. He examines his own hand, which was cut during the fight. Fearing consequences, Nick uses a rag to scrub his fingerprints and blood off the handle of the knife before chucking it into the river. When he finally returns home, he finds Helen and Lucas sorting out their home movies, an old video featuring Brendan playing on TV. Helen notices his cut hand and rushes to get a bandage while he goes to take a shower. As the water washes the remaining blood down the drain, his guilt and grief bubble and spill over. He is sobbing on his knees when Helen walks in and holds her drenched husband, unaware of his innocence that is also being washed down the drain. The next day, Billy visits a car body shop, which is a front for his boss's operation. He walks into the office of his boss, a man named Bones, to drop off the proceeds from their night of selling drugs. Billy and his men might be cooking and selling drugs, but Bones is the kingpin. A big and angry man who runs the entire operation, he berates Billy for the shortage of sales, dismissing him from the room. Billy returns to the gang's main base, an abandoned location where his men cook drugs. One of his most trusted guys, Boddy, approaches him with grim news. Boddy informs Billy that Joe has died. Meanwhile, Nick is at work, trying to pretend that his life as the company's vice president continues as normal. Detective Wallace arrives at his office to inform him that his son's killer was found dead. Nick acts surprised and asks how it happened, pretending he just heard the news. The detective is highly suspicious, especially with Nick's hand all bandaged up. Back in the slums, the gang gathers at their hangout pub to discuss the situation. Some of the members are drinking up to Joe, believing him to have been a good soldier. They initially discuss the competing gangs that could have assassinated Joe. However, one of the members says his sister saw a man in a suit lingering near the apartment the night Joe was killed. Gangsters do not wear suits. Billy shows the sister a picture of Nick in a recent newspaper article covering Brendan's murder and confirms that it was the man that she saw. Billy realizes that the grieving father has taken the law into his own hands, and he vows to make Nick suffer. Nick leaves his office building and walks down a crowded city street. He buys some things from the pharmacy to rebandage his hand, unaware that Boddy is stalking him from behind. Billy watches from a distance, keeping a close eye on the target. Just before Boddy can pull his gun and shoot, Nick senses the danger. He swings his heavy suitcase with all his might and disarms the gangster. Seeing this failure, Billy and his men draw their weapons and begin firing wildly into the middle of the crowded street. Nick dodges the bullets, fleeing into a tight lane, followed by Billy and his slew of men. Nick drops his bag to escape faster, but the thugs are chasing him like a pack of rabid wolves. Billy takes every possible opportunity to shoot at the fleeing father. Nick forces his way through the back door of a commercial building, runs through basements, frantically runs up some stairs, and ends up in a multi-story parking lot. He urgently needs a distraction, so he moves between the parked vehicles and randomly activates multiple car alarms to confuse the gangsters. Nick runs up the concrete ramps and reaches the top, outdoor floor. He thinks he has lost them, but Billy tasked a gang member named Jamie to take the stairs straight up top. Nick hides behind a car until he gets the opportunity to tackle Jamie from behind. Shots are fired into the air, and Nick manages to disarm Jamie before grabbing a crowbar from inside a car and beating him up. Jamie manages to retake his gun, but his remaining bullets miss Nick, who sneaked inside a car. Jamie lunges at Nick inside the car, and they exchange punches in the confined space. Nick fights with pure adrenaline and manages to entangle Jamie with the seatbelt. During the violent struggle, the car is shifted into reverse and travels across the rooftop. Nick throws himself out of the open door just in time, escaping the rolling vehicle. The car plunges off the high ledge and crashes into the street below. Jamie falls to his death, trapped inside the crushed metal, while Nick lies panting on the concrete floor, listening to the distant sirens of approaching police cars. After surviving the terrifying ordeal, Nick receives a frantic phone call from Helen. She is panicking because Lucas has vanished from school. Nick rushes to find his son, correctly guessing that Lucas went to the gas station where Brendan was murdered. Nick finds his boy standing at the tragic scene. A bitter argument erupts between them. Lucas thinks their parents would be less distraught if he were the one who got killed instead of Brendan, their golden boy. Nick sternly tells him to get in the car because the streets are incredibly dangerous. He brings Lucas home safely, and Helen tightly hugs the boy, begging him never to leave home like that again. Meanwhile, back in the abandoned mental hospital, Billy goes through Nick's abandoned suitcase and finds his wallet, along with a picture of the rest of his family. The very next morning at the insurance office, Bodhi bypasses the security desk and heads straight to Nick. He hands a big package to Nick and makes threats of death before security escorts him away. The package is the suitcase that Nick had dropped. Inside, he discovers his family picture with a thick marker crossing out the faces of his wife and children. This grim message implies that the mobster intends to kill all of his family. A phone number is written behind the picture, so Nick calls it. Billy answers the phone with a menacing tone. Nick screams into the receiver, threatening to cut Billy open if he ever goes near his family. Billy reveals that Joe is actually his little brother, and he plans to pay for Joe's life with Nick's entire family. The call disconnects, and Nick is engulfed by a wave of absolute terror. He urgently calls home and warns Helen and Lucas to stay inside and lock the doors. He then calls Detective Wallace, informing her of his concerns and requesting backup personnel. Nick abandons his office and drives home recklessly. When he arrives, he runs through the house and locks all of the windows, leaving everyone concerned by his frantic behavior. Detective Wallace arrives at the property shortly after and confronts Nick directly. She tells him that his foolish quest for vengeance has started this mess, entirely endangering his own family life. She requests that he confess to the murder of Joe Darley to end the cycle of violence, but he stays quiet. She doesn't push, but she does leave 2 armed police officers stationed outside the house to stand guard through the night. Later that night, Nick stands guard by the staircase when he's suddenly jolted awake by the loud blaring of a car alarm outside. He rushes to the window and discovers that the officers have been murdered. The armed thugs are already inside. One of them tries to ambush Nick, but he gets beaten up by a bat that Nick has been holding onto. He throws the bat at another guy as he runs upstairs seconds before the man shoots his gun. Nick manages to evade numerous gunshots in the bathroom and fights one back, tackling him into falling from the second floor together with Nick himself. It's too late. They've already taken Helen and Lucas hostage, who are brought downstairs by Billy's men. Nick watches in absolute horror as Billy ruthlessly shoots his family with no second thought. Billy then shoots Nick directly in the stomach, and the father collapses onto the floor in a pool of his family's blood. The gang members look at the bodies and leave the house, assuming that the entire family is dead. The next time Nick opens his eyes, he's at the hospital. The lingering trauma and panic cause him to throw a fit, needing to be sedated. He's calm when he wakes up again, but it's due to the resignation of having lost his whole family. Detective Wallace enters the room and warns him that he needs to stop this war. She also imparts some good news. Lucas is still alive, barely surviving his wounds. Nick springs up and demands to see his son. Lucas is in a worse condition than he was, still hooked up to many machines. Nick requests some time alone to talk to his comatose son, which Wallace provides. After apologizing for ruining their family's lives, Nick runs away through the bathroom window. He makes his way back to his house, which has become an active crime scene covered in police tape. He changes out of his hospital gown and goes straight to the bank to empty his entire account, stuffing the massive amount of cash into a bag. He sets out to hunt down Billy Darley. With the help of his co-worker, he finds the rundown bar where the gang is known to hang out. Nick approaches the bartender, putting some cash on the table, and asks about the gang's whereabouts. The bartender ignores the money and heavily taunts him in Spanish. Nick reveals that he perfectly understands the language, and his patience instantly evaporates. In a sudden fit of rage, Nick begins beating the bartender mercilessly. Through sheer physical force, Nick ends up collecting Billy's location, as well as the address of a local black market gun dealer, upon his request to buy guns. Nick visits the arms dealer first, who turns out to be Bones. He initially displays no interest in doing business with a random stranger. However, his attitude changes quickly when Nick displays the bag full of cash. Bones opens up his secret armory, laying out a few recommended handguns. Nick wants them all and also asks for the double-barreled shotgun and heavy revolver. Paid in excess cash, Bones packs Nick's new arsenal and includes the manual and some bullets as freebies. Just as Nick walks away from his desk, Bones asks if he's the one who's after Billy Darley. Bones reveals that Billy and Joe are his biological sons. Nick freezes, expecting the man to shoot him right there. Instead, Bones implies that Billy has been a thorn in his side for way too long, and he won't stop Nick from killing his son. Bones believes in a brutal code of the streets and feels that Billy has finally brought this deadly karma upon himself. Nick brings his arsenal to his house's dimly lit garage, spending hours getting used to the unfamiliar firearms. He knows he's going on a suicide mission, and he fully embraces the dark transformation. Nick shaves his wounded head, removing any trace of the mild-mannered executive executive he used to be. He cleans and rewraps his wounds. Following that, he goes through Brendan's belongings and finds the jacket his son wore the day he died. Nick slowly puts the jacket on, letting the memory of his boy act as his final armor. He loads his pockets with heavy ammunition and heads for the gang's headquarters. Nick drives to a rundown apartment building to find a gang member named Hiko. He bursts the door open with the shotgun, completely shocking the mobster inside. Nick places the barrel of the gun directly at Hiko's throat and demands to know where Billy is. Hiko folds almost instantly, revealing the abandoned mental hospital as their base. Nick then forcefully directs the terrified man to call Billy. When Billy answers the phone, Hiko frantically warns him that Nick Hume is still alive and is coming for them. Billy suddenly realizes the true danger. Nick pulls the trigger and finishes the gangster right there. Billy hears the deafening roar of the fatal shot over the open phone line and finally realizes that a war has arrived at his doorstep. Moments later, Bones Darley drives up to his son's station to discuss the escalating situation. Bones is furious that his son's reckless actions have brought a heavily armed madman into their world. He firmly cautions Billy that things are getting out of control and directly tells him to quit attacking Nick. Billy is deeply disgusted by his father's words, hating that Bones only cares about the weapons business. In a sudden and shocking act of cruelty, Billy draws his weapon and brutally murders his own father, shooting Bones directly in the head. Billy stares at the corpse without a shred of remorse and steals his car to drive to his base. Nick arrives at the abandoned mental hospital in Hiko's car. He grips the steering wheel and slams his foot on the gas pedal. His car bursts through the heavy entrance, directly crushing a gang member who was standing guard in a van outside the entrance. Nick gets out of the car and steps into the dark corridors of the facility. He sneaks around until one thug runs into the room he's in. He opens fire. One thug down, and another one shoots frantically at Nick, missing all his shots. Nick uses the crumbling walls for cover and fires again, missing his shots too, as he is an amateur. In a game of armed cat and mouse, Nick manages to shoot another thug out the window. A blast almost hits him moments after, with two more thugs on his tail. Moving on to using a handgun, Nick shoots rapidly at the thug so he can escape towards the staircase. From above, he shoots his shotgun, injuring one of the two thugs. Just then, Billy finally arrives at the facility, finding some of his men already dead. Nick and the two thugs continue their silent pursuit of one another. Nick sees one of them ready to shoot and dodges just in time. Nick shoots through the same wall 1 second after, killing the thug. Nick finally reaches the large open chapel of the hospital, where the stained glass windows cast a bloody red light. Hearing a sound, Nick turns around, only for Billy to spring out and shoot Nick from the front of the room. It hits his torso, but Nick fires back, hitting Billy's arm and fingers. From behind, Bodie shows up and shoots, hitting Nick's neck. Nick puts a bullet in his head before whipping back and shooting at Billy again, hitting his torso. Heavily wounded, Nick slumps onto the wooden pew, dropping his empty gun on the floor. From the front of the room, Billy still tries to shoot at him, but misses every shot due to his own grave injuries. The grand battle leaves both of them terribly injured. Billy, gasping for air and bleeding heavily, also stumbles over and sits down right next to the man who destroyed his gang. They sit shoulder to shoulder on the same pew, like two exhausted congregants in a twisted church service. Billy turns his head and looks at Nick's shaved head and bloody clothes. A sarcastic and cruel smile spreads across Billy's face. Billy proudly declares that he has successfully turned the mild-mannered family man into a vicious, cold-blooded killer. The tragedy is that Billy is entirely correct. Nick has lost his soul in this dark pursuit. Nick does not argue or show any emotion. He simply reaches into his leather jacket and removes another weapon from his pocket. Nick looks at him with empty eyes, asks if he is ready, and pulls the trigger. When Nick walks out of the ruined hospital, it's already light outside. He drives home. He is bleeding heavily, and he knows that his body is shutting down. He staggers into his living room and sits down on the same couch where he used to watch television with his wife and children. Nick picks up the remote control and begins watching a home video of his whole family. A few moments later, the front door opens, and Detective Wallace arrives. She looks at the dying man on the couch and delivers a single piece of news that cuts through the darkness. She informs him that Lucas is out of his coma and has started moving. A profound sense of relief washes over Nick's features, even as he feels the misery far more deeply than any physical pain. He has lost his wife, his eldest son, and his own soul, but his youngest boy will get to see another day.